Good afternoon, and welcome to the third and final WISH seminar for our 23-24 series. My name's Lise Elliott. I'm a professor of neuroscience in the Chicago Medical School, and on behalf of my co-chairs, Christine Burgess and Susie Calkins, I'd like to welcome you, and especially our speaker, Todd Beer. I did want to just describe the series that we adopted for the year, which is Mother Earth Under the Microscope, to look at the impact of climate change on health, and particularly women's health. So we kicked off in the fall with our fall symposium by Cecilia Sorensen from Columbia University. If you missed that, or our winter symposium by Saibatu Mansoure, they're both available on our YouTube channel, as this seminar will be as well. So I encourage you to participate in those. And it was actually in the fall symposium where we realized the great insight of today's speaker, Todd Beer, who was a panelist following Dr. Sorensen's keynote, and realized we were just scratching the surface on his understanding of the intersection between gender and climate change. So we're very pleased to welcome him for today's seminar. Dr. Beer actually started his career, I just learned, as a photojournalist and working in Bosnia, and then had many other formative experiences before beginning his PhD, or receiving his PhD at Indiana University in sociology. He's now associate professor of sociology and chair of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Lake Forest College, our near neighbor, where he teaches and conducts research on the sociology of climate change, along with the social movements surrounding climate change and cultural globalization. Much of his research is centered on communities and organizations throughout Kenya, but he's also analyzed major protest events in Chicago, Washington, New York, and Paris. He's currently examining the ways in which global norms around environmental conservation, gender equality, and education intersect with developmental efforts in a rural Maasai community in southern Kenya. His research also examines the movement for global climate justice among U.S. protesters and the various NGOs that comprise the Pan-Africa Climate Justice Alliance. So we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Beer for his seminar, Climate Justice and Health in a Gendered World, Responsibilities, Risks, and Response.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back. I always find, similar to my home institution of Lake Forest College, that the students and faculty and staff here are very engaged. So I'm very happy to be back. Remind me if we have time during Q&A, when you said the theme of the series, Mother Earth Under the Microscope, there's all kinds of gendered stuff about Mother Earth and what we do to the Earth. All right. So today I'm going to talk primarily, I'll get more specifically, but I'm going to start broad around the ideas of climate justice. Climate justice is a frame for understanding and analyzing the causes and harms of climate change, as well as the conditions of adapting to it, and who gets a voice in how we address this issue. So these four very broad questions are kind of the fundamental roots of the ideas of climate justice. Who caused it? Who's harmed by the consequences? Who can adapt to the risks? And who decides what we end up doing about it? The term climate justice emerged in the 1990s out of the environmental justice movement that was around, emerged in the 1980s out of the civil rights movement that obviously went on decades prior to that. So what I'm going to try and do today is to bring you a framework that will extend beyond any specifics of the current situation regarding climate change and help you to analyze all the situations you encounter in the coming decades of your career and life. It's a big task. We'll see if I get there. But the roots of climate justice, or the philosophy of it, again, is pulled in large part from the ideas of environmental justice. Key aspects of that being that the polluter should pay, right? And the distribution of the benefits and the risks of what we do as humans and as societies should be distributed fairly. Climate justice shifts climate change from talking about polar bears to talking about communities, from talking about melting glaciers to talking about ancestral homelands. So I'm not going to do a lot of science here, but let's talk initially just about the causes to kind of burn this into our memory even further. There are four primary gases accumulating in our atmosphere that subsequently trap more heat, which originates from the sun, that would have previously escaped Earth's energy system. Hopefully you are familiar with at least the primary, what they refer to as greenhouse gases because they trap heat, and that's carbon dioxide. And while this is part of the natural system, what we are mostly concerned about is the rate and amount that human activity is generating. Other gases that contribute to this unprecedented rate of warming include methane, nitrous oxide, and fluorinated gases like chlorofluorocarbons or CFCs, which we have largely banned and are still trying to phase out, or HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons, fluorocarbons. One thing to note about these gases, unlike the steam on a pot on your stove, they don't emerge and then dissipate. They linger. Their heat trapping power in our atmosphere remains for 10, sometimes 100 or more years up there. So what we're doing now will continue to trap heat for the foreseeable future. And that's important when we talk about climate justice in another aspect. So where do these come from, right? Obviously, again, hopefully you've heard about fossil fuels being the main source, the main driver of the emissions of these four gases. Fossil fuels being oil, coal, and gas garner their energy from millions of years ago, compressed under the earth, and we are now pulling them out, right? And so these emissions, primarily carbon dioxide and methane from that process, not only involved when we drive our gas-powered vehicles or charge our electric vehicles with coal power, right? So you have to think about where you're charging those electric things as well. But not only the use, but also the extraction and the refining contributes to that process. The manufacturing of cement also releases a lot of carbon dioxide, and then our landfills and the way we raise livestock also emits a lot of methane into the atmosphere. Nitrous oxide primarily comes from fertilizers that we apply in our agricultural systems, and then those fluorinated gases predominantly from refrigerants that are used in our air conditioning, our refrigerators, and other kinds of manufacturing processes. So what do we do that emits these in high-income nations, right? Primarily, it is our transportation, driving, trucks, boats, planes, all of those things primarily burn fossil fuels still. That is shrinking and needs to shrink faster and more. And then how we produce electricity and warm our homes, right? So most of us, our electricity is produced somewhere else, gets delivered to our home. For most of us in this area where our winters are brutal and we're so happy it seems to be over, that fossil fuel is burned in our house. We don't see it. It's deep in our furnace, but you're burning natural gas, and then that heat is being distributed through your home, and those emissions are going out the stack of your home. Industry of all kinds, our waste production, construction, and the way, again, that we do food systems with heavily nitrogen-based fertilizers going into our industrial agricultural systems produces a lot of that as well. And then for us, some aspects of deforestation or land use change contribute to that as well. Not that that emits CO2, but you're taking away parts of the ecosystem that otherwise absorb CO2. So subsequently, it contributes to further accumulation. In low-income countries, this is a slightly different picture. It is largely deforestation and food systems that are contributing their aspects of these greenhouse gas emissions. Deforestation is fairly clear. We think Brazil, Indonesia, the Congo basin in Central Africa, and food systems. And it's largely not how they do it, but how they change the land use, right? So as agriculture and food systems expand in lower income nations, they are tearing down or altering rich ecosystems that absorb a lot more carbon other than kind of a monocrop agricultural system, which is unfortunately become the global model. They also obviously contribute some via transportation and electricity, but because of their economies and their levels of development, those are much less significant. All right, so if we move on from there, then we bring those in. If those are the causes of climate change, we need to think about, and we want to talk about climate justice. We want to talk about the responsibility. Ironically, most of the people who are more responsible are at less risk. That's us individually, us accumulatively in our kind of highly developed societies, versus those that are less responsible. And there are numerous ways to look at this from a climate justice frame. Oftentimes it is done by looking at the nation state, right? This is where policies are made. So in some respects that makes sense, but greenhouse gas emissions don't go up in the air and stay within those boundaries on a map. They dissipate to the world, and the effects are felt by the world as well. So that can become a challenging aspect. But so China is the net largest emitter, but the US and then the EU, including the UK still for this case, are each historically responsible for 20% of carbon emissions. China is only responsible for 11%. And when I say historical emissions, again, it's not how much are you emitting today, it's how much have you contributed that is still up there, trapping heat in our energy system. We could look at that we could look at nationally and we could look per capita, right? Because obviously China and India have 2 to 3 times more population of the United States. And if we look at per capita, the United States, the average person emits 16.6 tons of greenhouse gases. In China, half of that, 7.2 tons per person. In India, a tenth of that, 1.7 tons per person, and it takes 28 Kenyans to emit 0.6 tons per person to accumulate to similar levels of here in the United States. We could also look at it in primary producers. So in making these slides, after I submitted them, did a little more digging, and it's changed. It used to be the top 200 companies that were looked at for divestment purposes, but now we're down to 100 investor or state-owned entities that are responsible for 71% of the emissions via the products they make, which we consume, or how they make them. And we can compare these to the frontline communities. Those are the communities that live near refineries, that live near toxic dumps, etc. We can also look at climate justice from an individual standpoint, right? So irrespective of the country you live in, it's estimated that if we look from 1990 all the way coming up to 2030 rapidly, the world's wealthiest 10% of individuals, again, regardless of their nationality, will emit about 50% of the total emissions of the world. The world's poorest 50% of the population, on the other hand, emits just 9% of the total emissions. And by the way, you're probably doing some math in your head and excusing yourself from that group, but to be in the top 10% in the world, you only need to make $55,000 a year. We can also look at this by age, right? Older generations versus younger generations. Younger generations will spend their lifetime struggling through the consequences of the actions brought on by older generations. And this is ongoing. There's not a generation that we can blame. As we can continue and not do enough, then future generations can look back and claim some of those philosophical or moral claims about climate justice. This frame has been used in a lot of headline grabbing court cases recently where young people are suing the state of Montana, suing the US federal government, et cetera, to try and instigate change. But we can think about this also, think about the next 20 years of climate change or the next 60 years of climate change and what those experiences, how those experiences will differ. And then lastly, we can, there's a few studies that point to men in more highly industrialized nations on average consuming more or emitting more than women. All right. So all of the harms of climate change originate with the increase of the global average of air, surface, and water temperatures. These have been increasing unprecedentedly since the emergence of fossil fuels. And yes, this is increases that take into account the so-called natural cycles, the wobble of our orbit, the changes in the fluctuations in the sun's energy, that kind of thing. The rate of warming has been increasing, especially since 1970. And this last year with global warming and a portion of that boost helped by El Nino and ironically, the effects of cleaning up other air pollution that had a cooling effect, we have seen these unprecedented temperatures. In fact, each of the last 10 months has been the hottest of that month on record. Last year was the warmest calendar year on global temperature data records going all the way back to 1850. It was over a half a degree centigrade warmer than a more recent average, 1991 to 2020, and nearly 1.5 degrees warmer than pre-industrial levels. Now, 1.5 degrees is that kind of benchmark that we were trying to stay under, according to the Paris Agreement, and that's because the differences between 1.5 and even 2 degrees are in some ways exponential. If we go beyond 2, we're not here having a conversation, really. So this has become highly problematic. All right, so if we look at that heat, there are all kinds of other indirect impacts that heat has, including rising sea levels. As scientists in the room, you know, warmer liquid has more volume, right? So it's not just the melting glaciers, but also something called thermal expansion, where our oceans are getting bigger because they're getting warmer. We have both droughts and floods, which always confuses people. Like, come on, how can we have both? Well, it's because warmer air, one, amplifies evapotranspiration, so we have more droughts more frequently and more severely, and warmer air holds more water. So when it does rain, we have more frequent heavy precipitation events. Obviously, heat waves are a part of this. Forest fires damaging not only for the forests and maybe homes that they destroy, but as we all lived through last summer here in Chicago and all across coming down from Canada, decreased air quality, and that obviously impacts our health. Hurricanes projected becoming stronger. You're really going to want to pay attention to this coming late summer and fall as the Atlantic water temperatures are again off the charts, no pun intended there, off the charts, and that energy gives hurricanes more power to form and be even stronger. So these problems harm billions of people and cost hundreds of billions of dollars in damage a year. One recent study estimated that climate change costs the world $16 million an hour. All right, so we can look in detail at the effect of each of these as well, right? Rising seas then has subsequent impact on our societies, threats to fresh water supplies, that impact our health, coastal erosion, right? So particularly during the winter, if the temperatures don't drop low enough, and we see that here in Chicago, does our lake freeze as often anymore? No. So if we have strong winter storms, those waves then are eroding the coast. Same things happens on the ocean coasts, not just the Great Lake coasts. Sunny day or high tide flooding, right? Not necessarily about rain, but king tides, high tides now encroaching further into our communities, depending on the location. Also, then the rising sea levels inundating the groundwater and pushing that groundwater level up. So it takes much less for floods to occur. Both of these things are happening in Miami, which again is why you shouldn't buy property there. What else? Loss of property value. So imagine trying to get a 30-year mortgage somewhere on the coast or somewhere that doesn't have water or somewhere that's had 600-year floods in the last 20 years. If you own that property already, try selling it. The actual physical loss of property, right? Erosion, damage from all of these things can you will might not only lose your home, but the actual land that was there previously. Subterranean city infrastructure, trains, electric lines, internet cables, all those things that we buried in tunnels under large metropolitan areas, New York in particular, can matter a great a deal. All right, many of those most at risk have contributed very little to the problem. And again, this is kind of the crux of climate justice. It asks us to look more closely at the collective we. So when we say we caused it, we're going to have problems because of it. We want to interrogate that, unpack it, think more critically about it. When you look at those who are most vulnerable and impacted, those whose livelihood are destroyed, we see that the risks are not distributed evenly. Small island nations are struggling to prevent their fresh water when they are surrounded by the ocean. That's very important. Prevent that fresh water from becoming undrinkable due to salination. Indigenous populations in Alaska and Louisiana are losing their cultural homelands due to rising seas and rapid cultural erosion. So those two middle pictures there are, one is from top is Louisiana, the bottom is Shishmaref, Alaska, which is one of many communities that are having to move inland because of the loss of their community. Sunny day flooding in poor communities is making getting to school and work harder and less predictable. All right, so each of these also has specific impacts on health. As it gets warmer and wetter, some of our pathogens are going to spread further. The malarial zones spreading further. A lot of my work is in Kenya, Nairobi, their capital city. About 4 million people, largely sheltered from malaria because of the altitude. Well, as the heat warms, that the malarial zone is going to move up and potentially impact them and many millions of others. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I just wanted to remind you, I'm not going to go through all of them because Dr. Sorensen gave such an excellent and comprehensive talk earlier in the series. And again, you can watch that video if you missed it, and I highly recommend it. I've never seen somebody deliver like a textbook in 60 minutes, basically. It was very abundantly thorough. And I don't want to replicate our argument. So what I want to do is get a little bit more abstract with the goal of giving you a set of tools that you can think critically about as you confront these problems throughout your lifetime and career. While we have a tremendously greater understanding of the climate crisis, it's not a static problem. And the problems that we face will change. So what I want you to do is to first start thinking about this through a gendered lens. And a couple of notes here. First, the focus of this talk, gender, is not the only socially constructed identity that we use in our society to distribute advantage, right? Race, class, sexual identity being among the others that Kimberly Crenshaw asks us to explore or consider in her concept that she developed called intersectionality. Additionally, most of this talk and most of this research continues to focus on kind of a classic gender binary, a heterosexual household arrangement, and social forces are certainly challenging and changing that. Lastly, this talk takes a global view, so it would be a little bit more about the impoverished areas of the global South than simply confined to here in the United States. So I argue that in the current iteration, advantage is distributed through a gendered system in 3 key areas that are related to climate justice. The first is resources, and we can't just think about money. Those are important, but let me see. I think I want to get through all these. Okay, so when we think of livelihood, food, water, shelter, widely accessible to most, certainly not all, but most here in the United States. For billions of people who live in abject poverty around the world, these are much more precarious. We can also think of financial resources. Income and wealth are obvious, but think about insurance. If your home is destroyed due to a climate crisis event, hopefully you have homeowners insurance. It's a disaster, but you can rebuild, right? You can seek health because you have health insurance. If you were in agriculture or a farmer, you would have crop insurance. If you lost your life, your loved ones might be cared for by life insurance. Other countries, those that live in poverty, billions of people in the global south, do not have that. There is no insurance. If their house is gone, it's gone. We also should think of knowledge as through the gendered lens. So who has access to these things, right? Who controls income and wealth? Who has more advantages there? Who has more access to formal education throughout the world? Who has, after formal education, who has access to information, right? All of these climate crises involve knowledge about how to respond, how to prepare, how to react to them in very important ways. So how many of our health crises, right, are driven by a lack of financial resources and maybe a lack of knowledge? All right. When we think about authority, right, we have all kinds of decisions that are being made and people having different levels of authority in there. Do women have more or less autonomy? What voice do women have in decisions in each household? And who can participate more fully in politics? If we understand how these work in a gendered system, we can understand then how those might have negative impacts in health and other incomes. Let's see, safety, right? Authority also comes in the form of safety. So how do cultures and the perpetration of violence impact how women navigate their lives, where they can go, the decisions they feel empowered to make, and the risks they face inside and outside the home in the midst of, again, all of these amplified crises? Policy, right? There's authority in who gets to decide these in politics, who's elected, how rich is the democratic process, if it's democratic at all, where this kind of gendered relationship is happening. And when there are questions that organizations, whether it's an NGO, a medical provider, a state or local government, who are the stakeholders that are brought to the table, and do women get those kinds of representation there? Lastly, women in science, right? Science is the production of legitimated knowledge, right? If we don't have more women in science, which this room is pretty well represented, um, then we're missing questions, right? Who gets to ask the research question? Are women's issues considered? Is any of this gendered lens considered when that research question was asked? Or do we just skip over that? And now we have a bunch of knowledge that didn't take that into effect and then is less effective. We also have sociology studies gender roles, right? Our social roles in all types, those are defined for us, right? We're not robots. We have some agency, but there's a lot of social forces that direct us in one particular way, right? So within communities, who has a voice? Who can take leadership roles? Who has status? Within a household, who is disproportionately burdened with parental roles, right? Childcare, food provision, agriculture, water, getting fuel, depending on where you live. Who has that autonomy and authority as an income earner, or who is prohibited from that? And then we have different roles in labor, right? Here in the United States, we see this play out in the gender pay gap that's gotten smaller, but is now kind of plateaued and is relatively persistent, right? So who has precarity or security in formal or informal labor force? Who has access to which fields through the gender typing of work? These are all very important. So the gendered lens also rests in a larger context that I want us to consider and think that if we kind of run these problems through these two lenses, then we will have a much greater understanding, right? So this is the national context, a cultural context, and a household context. So within a nation, we have laws. Does this court system provide protection, or does it reinforce gender inequality? Does the nation in its economy gain a comparative advantage in the global economy through low labor costs? And subsequently, what does that do to women? Think the clothing industry in Bangladesh and those kinds of things. So that matters. Culture, norms, values, and beliefs, right? What are the norms for what women do, what they access? Um, um, is it generating more or less inequality among women? What are the predominant religious beliefs? And where does it position women? What are the entrenched norms of behavior for women, and does it limit the scope of their opportunities? Within a household, these things play out as well. Is the structure of the household more nuclear, or is it extended family? Is the household geographically mobile, or are you rooted to a place? Are girls seen as a burden because of dowries and marriage payments, that because of the household structure? So by looking at the consequences of climate change through these lenses, we can see the climate justice frame, the ways the consequences of human caused warming falls differently on different people. Based on their particular social context. By overlooking gender equality, we miss how the health consequences of the climate crisis are experienced differently. If we ignore it, we will forever treat the symptoms and not the cause. So think about, all right, if we take floods as an example, right, how does that run through the roles of the gender context that people are in, impact with their culture? And then, for example, you have women in Southeast Asia who the culture drives them to have extremely long hair, often worn in braids, and then layers and layers of full clothing. If you are trying to escape a typhoon or a flood by swimming, then you are weighted down, right? Jump in a pool with all your clothes on and try and swim, right? So more women drown in Southeast Asia during these events when they're trying to escape. Or if we take a hurricane and we run that through the different types of authority that we might have, maybe through the household structure, if your husband, and let's combine it with the national economy, if your husband is away working in another country and a hurricane is coming, do you have the authority to leave your home? Can you take your kids without your husband's permission and go somewhere else, or are you stuck where you are to ride out the storm? If you do leave for any number of these reasons, if you do leave and go to a shelter, or as a woman now, you're more at risk of sexual assault or other kinds of violence. So all of these things, let's look really particularly at drought. Right, so this leads to different gender consequences. So if we think about drought, right, the gender consequences, if we just started here, we wouldn't have a full understanding, right? So there's unequal preparation for drought, maybe because women don't have as much education. They're not the recipients of formal government warnings or information about oncoming drought. Maybe they don't get to make household decisions about what kind of crops are planted. Do we get to switch and plant drought-resistant crops, or are we sticking with what we've always done because that's what my husband says? If I'm responsible for water provision in the midst of a drought, now I'm walking much further. I'm bringing my family potentially health risky water because there is less of it. I'm spending more time maybe boiling that water than I normally would. I am disproportionately burdened with care work, right? And that might lead me to have ongoing trauma, because if it's seen as my responsibility to help this family and the children, then and that doesn't work out, or we are constantly in these crises, then women are more likely to carry the burden of those things. All right, so we can do this for every aspect of this, right? So those are the harms. We can look at adaptation, right? The things that we're going to have to do in the face of some of these crises. Are we going to migrate? Who gets to make that decision? Are we going to get to change our agricultural processes, seek out other water sources, these kinds of things? If there's new technology to adapt to this, is it focused? Has it been run through a gender lens, or has it been seen through a gender lens? Will women who are in other parts of the world less likely to have as much formal education be able to access that technology? Will it be designed to help them, or will it be designed to help the gender roles of men? So by running again through these systems, we will be better prepared. All right, lastly, we have voice. right? This again also is going to be relative to who gets heard, is going to be relative to the context in which people live. So who has household authority? Who is seen as the expert? Who can advocate for the community, and in what way? Couple of examples where this is still not reached even the highest levels. In November of this year, Azerbaijan will host the 29th UNFCCC Conference of Parties, or COP meeting. So COP 29, you'll hear all about this in November. When they originally announced the organizing committee for this meeting, 29 means they've had 29 of these. It consisted of 28 men and 0 women. Fortunately, they put out a photograph of this and the world went berserk, rightfully so. And they were kind enough to add a dozen or so women to that panel. Even at COP meetings, female negotiators have complained about harassment and bullying. So climate justice through a gendered lens is not yet prevalent. All right, 2 other forms. I'm going to switch gears here a little bit, but I'll tie them together at the end. 2 other forms of climate change related patriarchy that I want to point out. They're very related. I'm not going to distinguish them much. Petromasculinity and systems justification theory. So we cannot talk about women being disadvantaged or disempowered without also talking about men who are advantaged, or who are either directly or passively support the continuation of a sexist and patriarchal system. So what is petromasculinity? This is the idea that much of the masculine identity in the United States is connected to, tied up in, and supported by, and expressed through a fossil fuel-based patriarchal system. So think industrialization, mechanization, control of nature, economic rationality, an economic system that advantages men, power to conquer and control nature. This is the identity of petro-masculinity. It is also tied up into racism, and then often expresses itself as climate change denial. So when fossil-fueled systems are threatened, this is seen as a threat to patriarchal rule, and it manifests itself in resistance to this change, right? In a justification of the system rather than an adaptation and mitigation of the system. So climate denial becomes part of identity protection, right? It's not about the science. It's not about policy. It's like, this is a fundamental disruption to a system that I have everything invested in. This can also, it can be seen as a crisis of legitimacy or identity for white men in particular. And what they've found is that then there's a tendency to mourn or mythologize an idealized United States. I don't know, can anyone think of a political slogan right now that relates to that? All right. So the biggest danger of this, right? The most dangerous outcome of petromasculinity is the delay or the dilution of sufficient climate action, right? Action to prepare for the risks, action to reduce the risks, to transform our world to avoid catastrophe. Data show that compared to men, women are more concerned about climate change, more likely to believe it's happening, and they know more about it if you test them objectively, but they are more likely to doubt their own knowledge. So they're either really good scientists, or there's something else again going on in our gender socialization that hits at that confidence. So by engaging in the denial of scientific consensus, by feminizing environmental action, right? Electric vehicles, renewable energy, being vegan, all seen as feminine rather than masculine. We become like more entrenched in the destruction of the ecosystem we all rely on. Think drill, baby, drill. Petromasculinity has contributed to the crisis we face today. So we have women in a gendered system being unequally impacted by climate change, and men trying to preserve that system. The problem is we face a crisis where even the so-called radical left policies that we have managed to pass remain lacking in their ambition. So the green line here is where we need to be. The blue lines, the blue shaded areas are where we are headed with all the policies we've already passed, Inflation Reduction Act and all. So as each year passes with insufficient action, that green slope gets steeper and steeper and eventually less and less attainable. So remember, many of us in the room will likely be able to shield ourselves from the worst of climate change. Climate justice argues that we have a moral obligation to direct our attention, our efforts, our resources, our politics towards those who have contributed little to the problem, are experiencing the harms now, and have few resources to adapt. In order for our response to be just and not simply replicate existing inequalities and harms, we need to look at the issue through a gendered lens, through a race lens, through a socioeconomic lens. I hope that you carry this lens with you and find it helpful in confronting all that we face today. Thank you.
Other questions? Wow. Thank you so much. That was terrific. What a great synopsis of the interaction between climate and gender, and of course other dimensions of stigmatized minorities.
It's like the prequel to Dr. Sorensen's.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I guess we don't have any questions online, although we would invite any of our Zoom participants to please put them in the Q&A section. Any questions from the audience we can start out with? Just.
Thank you very much. A really interesting thing that you pointed on quite briefly was the fact that quite often you have the women have to stay at home and the men move. Do you see this actually increasing with climate migration, where it's, especially when they lose all their wealth, their home, their animals, if it's a pastoral society, that the men are much more likely to immigrate, and that leaves basically their family back home? Is it not only that you've got these inequalities, but actually, unfortunately, they're going to be increased with climate change?
Likely, right? So there's lots of different causes. There's lots of kind of middle causes from when you get to the consequences of climate change to migration, right? So some of it's conflict over resources. So northern Kenya, semi-arid pastoralists fighting with guns and organization over watering holes and things like that. Well documented in the Years of Living Dangerously sequence about like the Syrian drought, subsequently fomenting the war within that country. So under some circumstances, I think there's no choice about like somebody can stay back and somebody has to go, right? But if there are persistent droughts or year after year, maybe it's not a drought every year, but maybe one year it's a drought, the next year it's a flood, the next year it's whatever, then yes, somebody may have to move on, especially for those kind of who are involved in subsistence agriculture, right? Somebody might have to move to the city. Right. And you think about men moving to the city away from their families, and you think of HIV contraction, right, being brought back to the families. You think about those decisions or people not being empowered left back at home. There's some research, though, that shows that when drought hits subsistence families, it's the woman who's compelled to try and find formal work, but more likely to be unemployed. And then you have things like being driven in, women and girls being driven into sex work, right? Because their families are subsistence farmers. And if their crops fail, it's their food, it's their seeds for the next year and that kind of stuff that's gone.
Other questions in here? Okay. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Beer. I appreciated your attention specifically to how the folks who contributed the least are the ones who face the risk the most. And you talked about different ways that manifests. And specifically, since your research is in Kenya, I wanted to specifically also raise the point of how like national history also plays a role in the circumstances that are at play. You know, Kenya was under direct British rule for 75 years and had enormous consequences on the development of Kenya. And a lot of global South nationalists would tell you and the people in this room that who are you as white academics in the global North to lecture global South folks about how they should develop their country, how they should operate, whether or not they should industrialize and develop to the standard of living that everyone here took for granted and did without asking anybody else of what the consequences of that would be. That how is it fair for you to tell them that they're not allowed to industrialize or they're not allowed to develop their economy the way everyone else was allowed to do?
Sure. I would hesitate to do that, actually. So this is very, very complicated. Fossil fuels are amazing, right? They are an amazing source of energy, and that's why they've allowed us to do what they've done. And so certainly from a climate justice perspective, that needs to be part of the conversation, because back in 1990, 92, when it wasn't called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change yet, but it was like Rio or whatever, they were going to talk about it and formulate this. And George W. Bush at the time went as the representative of the United States, as the president, and said, the United States lifestyle is not up for negotiation. And the countries of the global South said, we're out. We're not doing this. This is going to arrest our development. This is going to, you caused this problem, and now you want to use our land for carbon sequestration and your carbon offsets for flying around the world, again, myself included, and this kind of stuff. And so this has been a key sticking point in every negotiation of those conference of parties, right? And we keep chipping away a little. And 10 years ago, we promised 100 million a year above and beyond what was given. We barely reached that. Now they're talking about loss and damage, right? So countries who are wealthy are going to have to retract, right? We have to share technology, right? We can't oh, sure, we'll do this. By the way, let's forget about colonization and that you really started as a sovereign country 70 years ago. You're going to go ahead and compete equally on the world stage with us. But by the way, you're going to buy all our solar panels. You're going to make, we keep trying to make Elon Musk the richest man in the world by buying his batteries and eventually his vehicles and his trucks and his spaceships or whatever. And they're going to discover oil. They're going to discover more oil in Northwest Kenya, in Uganda, et cetera, et cetera. There are places there that just haven't been subject to interest. And we're going to have to make a decision, and we're going to have to make a decision as a globe, because they have a right to say that. They have a right to say, you developed this way, why didn't we? And I guess one thing that I would add is, in my research, it's difficult, or I think there's some error in trying to speak about a homogenous Kenyan voice, right? Or a homogenous global South voice, because there are people in the global South who are like, no way, you guys made a mistake. You fix it, and we're not going to follow that path, right? So there's tremendous opportunity here as well, if there is empathetic global cooperation, which we see occasionally. But so if you take the example of telephones, right? The telephone, we had wires running everywhere. We all had these phones in our houses before. Other countries didn't have that, right? So then by the time cellular technology comes along, they don't run lines. They leapfrog over that technology, and they just put up cell phones. Right? People who live without running water or toilets in Kenya have cell phones, right? They take them to the market on the weekends, charge them in a kiosk or whatever, but they have cell phones, but they don't need to run wires, right? So now there's this huge opportunity where it's maybe you don't need to run pipelines and refineries and gas stations everywhere. Maybe if we share technology, if we make these open source instead of let's just keep profiting off of them and, the profits accumulate to the core nations. There are opportunities there. But I think that it will be debate within those countries as well, right? You see shifts even in Brazil, right? This former president versus the current president. Former president let's extract all the resources, right? JBS, largest beef and pork producer in the world, based out of Brazil. Now we have a different president who's protecting the Amazon a little bit more. Yeah.
Other questions? I'll ask a question. Thank you for such a great presentation. Do you think that when we think about sort of this gendered lens that maybe policymakers are operating under, I mean, in general, how aware is that? I mean, is that even something that people are talking about at policy level, a gendered lens, or is it more impact and not thinking through those kinds of lenses?
I think there are places where you can find it. I certainly didn't invent or create or pull all of this out of my brain. This is the work of many other people, most of them women. But at the United Nations, right, you would see that. You'd see terms called like gender mainstreaming, mainstreaming, just kind of a word they cycle through. Now there's like climate mainstreaming, right, to try and get that always on the table, right? Don't have any conversation without talking about gender, without talking about climate, right? In our country, without talking about race, to figure out those different impacts as if you could design a universal something. So I think it's present. I don't think the U.S. is somewhere in the middle, right? I mean, I think the U.S. is fairly easy to critique, right? Especially with our politics as they are now. But if you go to other countries, you can find places where women have much more severe consequences for breaking the norms or challenging the gender norms, right? And so I think the U.S. shouldn't be seen as the model by any respects, but we're doing some. We're having conversations like this. We have a resurgence of a feminist movement in some way, and the Me Too movement, that kind of thing.
I want to ask a question that probably has no good answer to it, like many things in this field. But I was wondering if there is something where people who have all of that extra responsibility and are not perceiving the risk as their own, right? Like, how do you make that risk personal to them? And especially, right, the predominant, patriarchal male community where that risk is not just othered in order to invest them more in the problem?
That's a great question. And I think it's very difficult. I think that a lot of the research points to the power of stories, the power of storytelling, right? A lot of people just don't know. A lot of people, once they leave formal education, their source of information is one of the 24-hour news channels, right? And I mean, the heat waves right now going on in the global south, I don't watch those 24-hour news channels, so I don't know if they're covering it, but I doubt it. I doubt there's been a story on that, right? I doubt there's been a story on like prolonged drought of the pastoralists of East Africa or that kind of thing. So, you have one of the things I had to like settle on a long time ago was that we have a circle of interest and we have a circle of influence, and you need to find the places where those overlap. Otherwise, you're going to drive yourself crazy, right? So you have all of these colleagues, you have fellow students, you will have patients and family members and friends. We have social media, right? I don't try and like influence the world on social media, but I know I have friends and family who I don't talk to every day, that I made sure they knew about this talk and they could sign in and that kind of thing. And so I think not bombarding them with data, like all of the data says, don't bombard people with data if you want to change their mind about climate change. Tell them stories. Tell them stories that tap into their culture. So in regards to like petromasculinity, the solution to that, right, is to tap into other kind of masculine traits, right? The goal of the gendered lens is not to maintain that, right? As it shifts and it becomes dismantled, we need to shift it. But if you go with like, okay, I'm talking to a petro man or whatever that would be called, then you might tap into other aspects of that identity, right? the breadwinner and the protector of their family, right? You want to protect your family, you need to prepare for climate change, right? You want to protect your family, why not put solar on your house and you can be energy independent? People still think like we get all our oil from the Middle East, right? Which is not true. The US is the #1 oil producer in the world. But you could sell them on that. Like, do you want to get your oil from another country or do you want to produce your electricity on your own house? Right. So you can tap into other kind of cultural aspects that they find valuable and just shift it a little bit. Right. You go to West Texas, you don't talk about climate change, you talk about energy independence, and there's boom, 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 windmills all over the place in West Texas. So.
As a really kind of specific follow-up to that question, do you see when policy allows financial incentives or disincentives as a way to help motivate change among the small percentage of people who have more power? I'm thinking about recent tax law changes to private aircrafts, that there's going to be big natural consequences to that among hyper wealthy people in the next year. So I'm wondering if you think that those financial type incentives and disincentives might make a difference.
I think
when policy, when you can.
I think they can. I don't think that they are severe enough or fast enough right now. And so we hate taxes politically, right? And so the IRA bill is largely not tax penalties, but tax incentives, right? If you buy an electric vehicle, you can get $7,500 back from the federal government right now, depending on the vehicle. That's a reasonable incentive, right? But is the tax on private planes going to be enough, right? If you have enough resources, you can overcome any deterrent, right? And so I think there are tools that could work. I think we need to be careful with those because like taxes on fuels hit everybody equally, right? And so it has to be scaled in a way that doesn't disproportionately harm people who have few resources in the first place. So there are economic models out there for that. We just don't have the political will to pass them. Yeah.
Mike, for a sec. I had one, hopefully just quick question on this topic of, women's power. And as women achieve more political power, the concern is that they're going to adopt the petromasculine. I'm just thinking of a commercial that Marjorie Taylor Greene ran where she used her AK-47 or something to blow up a Prius. It is. So I don't know. Is there actually good data that women who are leaders are more concerned about climate change, or does once they get into the power, they sort of shift their priorities?
I don't know. So I think if I had to guess, I would say yes. Like if you looked at legislatures across the world, likely the more women who are a percentage of those legislatures, which can be controlled in all other kinds of ways than just like let the chips fall where they may, right? A lot of countries have quotas. A lot of countries have like parallel all female legislative bodies, those kinds of things. So I would think there would be all kinds of indicators like, we're socialized into the gender roles of care. It falls mostly on women, and that's not just for families, right? And so social provisions, protections from capitalism, et cetera. But being a woman doesn't necessarily mean you're going to embrace those perspectives, right? And so I think there are numerous examples, and this happens with race as well, where the system, if you want to win politics in the United States, whatever your gender or sex is, act like a man, right? And so in some ways that has played out with other female candidates besides the kind of extreme end of Marjorie Taylor Greene even. I mean, all of the efforts, right, that even Hillary Rodham Clinton had to go to kind of make herself feel tough, right, or present the still aggressive military U.S. domination kind of front. Yeah.
Well, if I can throw this back, we're out of time, but I just want to thank you again for a really fascinating talk. So much to think about. as we go forward with the Women in Science and Healthcare Symposium, I hope that I'm sure climate change will never be far from our focus. So please join me in thanking Dr. Beer. Wonderful seminar. I also want to thank our amazing team of support team who have helped make this possible. Many of whom are in the room right now, Brian Roush and Amy Hilsey. Amy's out there. And Jay Moat, Kara Liebert-Bass, Patty Bender, who I believe is with us, Nicole Ulibri, and Margaret Gonzalez, who I know is here as well today. Thank you so much. And we look forward to next year's series where our theme is going to be gender roles under the microscope. And so lots of tie-in here to these issues. So thank you all again for joining us.